Temperance Whitfield was 46 years old when the sheriff's men nailed a foreclosure notice to her porch post and told her she had 1 week to leave the only home she had ever known. It was her late husband's cousin, a banker named Cornelius Vane, who signed the papers that cast her out, citing a debt he claimed had gone unpaid, though Temperance had the ledgers to prove otherwise, ledgers no judge in that county would trouble himself to read. When the wagon finally rattled away from the Whitfield farm for the last time, she carried with her $31, a cedar trunk of her husband's tools, and a grief so quiet it had learned to sit still in her chest without complaint. 3 days later, at a county auction of abandoned properties nobody wanted, she spent 12 of those dollars on a collapsing orchard cabin at the edge of Amity Hollow, a place the auctioneer himself called worthless, its trees gone wild, its roof half fallen, its hearth cold for 20 years. Folks in town called it a fool's purchase, a widow throwing good money after bad. But sealed beneath that crumbling hearthstone lay something no one living had seen in 2 generations, a secret that would not only change the shape of Temperance's life, but would return to an entire community something it had been quietly robbed of long before she was born. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Temperance Whitfield. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten, overlooked, or written off by everyone around you, tell us in the comments where you are joining us from tonight. Temperance had been raised the daughter of a blacksmith and a midwife in the low hill country of southern Missouri, in a town so small it did not appear on most maps of the era, a cluster of clapboard houses and split-rail fences called Amity Hollow, pressed up against a ridge of oak and hickory that turned the color of embers each October. Her father, Samuel Ashford, kept a forge at the crossroads and taught her, against the custom of the day, how to read the temper of iron by its color, how to know when metal was ready to bend, and when it would only crack beneath the hammer. Her mother, Ruth, delivered nearly every child born in that valley for 30 years, and from her Temperance learned patience of a different kind, the patience of sitting through long nights beside frightened women, of trusting that most things which seemed to be breaking were, in truth, only changing. It was a household that measured wealth not in coin but in usefulness, and Temperance grew up believing, with the plain certainty of a girl who has never been told otherwise, that nothing capable of serving a purpose should ever be thrown away, whether it was a bent nail, a cracked churn, or a person the world had decided to overlook. She married Eli Whitfield when she was 22, a quiet, broad-shouldered man who farmed 40 acres on the eastern slope of the hollow, and who loved her. She always said, the way a man loves land he intends to tend for the rest of his life, without flourish, but without end. Together they raised 3 children in a modest farmhouse built by Eli's own father, and though the years brought droughts and hard winters and the ordinary griefs of rural life, they were, by every measure that mattered to Temperance, rich. She learned to preserve fruit so it would last 2 winters instead of 1, to mend harness leather so it outlived the horse that wore it, to coax a garden out of soil most farmers would have called spent. Neighbors came to her when something was broken and no one else believed it could be fixed, and she rarely turned them away, not because she had nothing else to do, but because she had been raised to believe that value was often hiding exactly where careless eyes refused to look. It was this same conviction, more than any romantic notion of fresh starts, that would eventually lead her to a ruined orchard cabin nobody else wanted. But before that, there was a season of loss so complete it nearly broke the shape of her. The trouble began, as trouble in small farming towns so often does, with a bad harvest followed by a worse winter. Eli had taken a loan 2 years earlier to replace a barn lost to lightning, a modest sum, arranged through the newly built Amity Hollow Trust and Savings, run by a man named Cornelius Vane, who had married into a prominent local family and installed himself as president of the only bank for 30 miles. Eli made his payments faithfully until the fever took him in the autumn of his 43rd year, sudden and merciless, the kind of illness that swept through river towns and left widows standing in church doorways before they had time to understand what had happened to their lives. Temperance grieved as any woman grieves the sudden absence of a whole life built alongside another person. But grief, in that country and that century, was rarely given room to breathe before practical matters arrived to crowd it out. Within a month, a letter came from the bank informing her that the loan, structured in Eli's name alone, was now due in full, a demand that defied the very terms Eli had signed, terms Temperance had witnessed herself and kept copied in her own hand in a small cloth-bound book she had always insisted on keeping, a habit her mother had taught her. Born of a lifetime of watching men make promises to women that were never put honestly to paper. She brought that book to Cornelius Vane's office, laid it open on his desk, and asked him plainly to explain the discrepancy between what her husband had signed and what the bank now claimed. Vane looked at her with the practiced patience of a man accustomed to being obeyed rather than questioned, told her the original terms had been amended by a clause she surely misunderstood, and suggested, not unkindly on the surface, that a grieving widow was hardly in a position to argue banking law with a county judge who golfed, as it happened, with Vane's father-in-law every Sunday afternoon. Temperance argued anyway. She wrote letters. She sought out a circuit lawyer 2 towns over. She even appealed to neighbors who had known Eli his whole life. But debts in that era belonged to paper, and paper belonged, more often than not, to whoever held the pen. Within 4 months, the farm was seized. Within 5, it was sold beneath its worth to a cousin of Vane's wife, a transaction so swift and so convenient that half the county whispered about it over supper tables for years afterward, though no one whispered loud enough to stop it. By the time Temperance stood on the porch of the only home she had known as a wife and mother, watching strangers carry her furniture down the front steps, her children were grown and scattered, her eldest son working the railroads in Kansas, her daughter married and settled 2 counties south, her youngest boy apprenticed to a cooper in St. Louis, none of them near enough or established enough to take in a mother with nothing but a trunk of tools and $31 to her name. She would not have asked them to anyway. That, too, was a lesson learned early. A woman who has spent her life fixing what others discard does not easily become the thing that needs fixing. She took a room above the mercantile for a week, paid for with coins she counted twice each night before sleep, and it was during that week, wandering the edge of town with nowhere particular to be, that she came upon the county auction notice pinned outside the courthouse, listing a handful of abandoned properties seized for unpaid taxes, properties nobody in Amity Hollow wanted enough to bid on. Among them was a parcel simply listed as the old Ashford Orchard Cabin, 6 acres, structure condemned, offered as is. The name stopped her. Ashford had been her father's name, her own name before marriage, though she had never known of any family land beyond her father's forge lot at the crossroads, and certainly no orchard. Curiosity, more than sense, carried her out to the auction the following morning. The cabin stood at the far northern edge of the valley, half swallowed by an orchard so overgrown it looked less like cultivated land than a forest that had once remembered order and slowly forgotten it. Gnarled apple trees leaning at angles no prune tree should lean, their barks silvered and split, their limbs heavy with small, hard fruit no one had harvested in decades. The cabin itself sagged on its foundation, its roof caved in on the northern corner, its door hanging by a single hinge, and yet something about the place refused to let Temperance look away, the way certain broken things had always refused to let her look away her whole life. When the auctioneer called the parcel, no one else raised a hand. $12, going once. Temperance surprised herself as much as the small crowd gathered there by lifting her own hand and saying the number aloud before she had fully decided to do it. The auctioneer laughed, not unkindly, and told her she'd bought herself a pile of kindling and a headache, and several onlookers murmured the same. A widow's foolishness, a woman with nothing left throwing away good money on a place even squatters had abandoned. Temperance said nothing in return. She simply walked the 6 acres alone that afternoon, running her palm along bark rough as old rope, and felt, for the first time in months, something other than grief settle into her chest. The first days at the cabin were spent in the plainest kind of labor, clearing brush, patching the roof with salvaged shingle, sweeping 2 decades of dust and leaf fall from floorboards that groaned but held. It was on the 3rd evening, kneeling before the hearth to clear ash and fallen mortar so she might finally build a fire against the autumn chill, that Temperance noticed the flagstone at the hearth center sat higher than its neighbors, its edge slightly proud, as though it had been lifted and reset by careless hands rather than settled by time. She worked her fingers beneath its lip, expecting stubborn stone, and instead felt it shift with unexpected ease, as if it had been designed to be moved rather than merely worn loose. Beneath it lay a shallow cavity lined with flat river stone, dry despite the damp of the surrounding earth, and inside that cavity sat a tin box no larger than a bread loaf, its surface freckled with rust, but it seemed sealed tight with wax gone brittle and cracked. Temperance sat back on her heels for a long moment before touching it further, aware of the particular silence that settles over a room when something long hidden is about to be found. When she finally worked the lid free, she discovered folded papers wrapped in oiled cloth, so carefully preserved that the ink upon them remained legible despite their evident age. And beneath the papers, a single brass key too small for any door she had yet seen on the property, and a woman's wedding band, plain and worn thin, engraved on its inner curve with initials that were not her own, yet felt, somehow, unaccountably familiar. The papers, once unfolded upon the cabin's rough table by lamplight, revealed themselves to be no ordinary correspondence, but a compact, drawn in careful copperplate hand, and dated 1841, establishing what its authors called the Amity Hollow Orchard Cooperative, a joint agreement between 7 founding families of the valley, pledging shared labor, shared harvest, and shared ownership of the very orchard land upon which Temperance now stood. Among the signatures at the compact's foot, faded but unmistakable, was the name Josiah Ashford. Temperance read the name twice, then a third time, her pulse loud in her own ears, for she had never once heard her father speak of an uncle, a grandfather, or any Ashford before his own generation who had lived in Amity Hollow. Further papers in the box, letters exchanged over subsequent years between the founding families, painted a picture of a cooperative that had thrived through the 1840s and 50s, an unusual arrangement for its time, binding together not only white settler families like the Ashfords, but also 2 families of free black farmers, the Coles and the Marburys, who had pooled resources with their white neighbors to plant and tend the very orchard that now stood wild and untended around the cabin, an arrangement remarkable enough that the letters spoke openly of neighboring towns regarding Amity Hollow's orchard compact with suspicion, even hostility, as an affront to the ordinary hierarchies of the age. And then, abruptly, the correspondence ceased in the spring of 1859, the final letter, penned by a woman named Eliza Cole, describing a visit from a land agent representing a newly formed bank in the county seat, a man who arrived with papers claiming irregularities in the original compact's filing, irregularities that would require the cooperative's members to sign over their individual shares, temporarily, pending a legal review that Eliza wrote she did not trust in the slightest. There the paper trail stopped, save for one final item tucked at the very bottom of the tin box, a single deed, dated several months after Eliza's last letter, transferring the entirety of the orchard's recorded acreage to a private holder, the signature at its base belonging to a man named Augustus Vane. Temperance sat with that name for a long while in the lamplight, turning it over the way she might turn a piece of iron before deciding how to strike it, because the name Vane was not unfamiliar to her, not remotely, for it was the very same family name borne by Cornelius Vane, president of the Amity Hollow Trust and Savings, the man who had so recently and so conveniently repossessed her own farm. It did not take her more than a day of careful thought and a visit to the county courthouse to examine the town's oldest land records, to confirm what she had already begun to suspect in her bones. Augustus Vane had been Cornelius's grandfather, the very founder of the bank that now bore the family name, and the fraudulent transfer of the orchard's shared land. 7 families' worth of labor and hope folded quietly into one man's private holdings had been the seed capital from which that bank, and that family's standing in the valley, had grown. The full weight of what she had found settled over Temperance slowly, the way understanding often does, less like a lightning strike and more like water finding the low places in a field after rain. She was not merely the accidental owner of an abandoned cabin. She was, by blood she had never known to claim, an heir to a wrong done nearly 30 years before her birth, a wrong that had never been undone, only buried, quite literally, beneath a hearthstone and the passage of 2 generations too occupied with survival to go digging for old grievances. The wedding band, she soon learned from records at the county clerk's office, cross-referenced against the compact's signatures, had belonged to Josiah Ashford's wife, a woman named Constance, who, according to a brief and sorrowful notation in the town's burial ledger, had died the same year the orchard was seized, of causes the ledger did not specify, but which the timing made easy enough to guess at. The brass key, smaller than any lock Temperance had yet found, remained for the moment a mystery, though she suspected, with the growing instinct of a woman used to solving what others left unsolved, that it belonged to something still hidden on the property, something the compact's founders had thought worth protecting even after the land itself had been stripped from them. Word travels quickly in small towns, and it was not long before whispers reached Cornelius Vane that the widow Whitfield, having purchased the derelict Ashford cabin at auction, had been seen visiting the county courthouse with unusual frequency, poring over land records that had gathered dust for decades. Vane, a man who had built his comfortable position in Amity Hollow on the quiet assumption that the past preferred to stay buried, did not wait long to act. He arrived at the orchard cabin himself one gray afternoon in late October, his carriage rattling up the overgrown lane in a manner that suggested he had rarely, if ever, troubled himself to visit the property before, and found Temperance in the yard, sleeves rolled to her elbows, clearing deadfall from beneath the nearest apple trees. He was polite in the manner of men who have never needed to be anything else, complimenting her industriousness, remarking on how surprised he'd been to hear she'd taken an interest in such old, worthless ground, and then, with the same practiced smoothness he had once used to explain away her husband's loan, suggested that she might find the cabin's foundation unsound, its title uncertain, and that the bank would be willing, out of what he called neighborly generosity, to purchase the property back from her at a modest profit over her original $12, sparing her the trouble of a structure likely to collapse before winter's end. Temperance listened to the entire offer without interrupting, wiped her hands on her apron, and then told him, in a voice that carried no anger though it carried no softness either, that she had found the Orchard Compact of 1841, that she knew whose signature closed it and whose signature undid it, and that she would be very interested to hear the bank's explanation for how 6 acres jointly held by 7 families had come, within a single season, to belong entirely to his grandfather. She watched something shift behind Cornelius Vane's eyes then, not quite panic, but the particular stillness of a man recalculating, and he left without another word about purchasing the property, though he did not leave without a final remark, offered lightly but unmistakably as a warning, that old papers meant little in a modern courtroom, and that a widow with no standing in this county would find few allies willing to challenge a family as established as his own. He was not entirely wrong to believe he held the advantage, for in the weeks that followed, Temperance found the town's warmth toward her curdling into something more cautious. The mercantile owner, who had once extended her credit without hesitation, grew suddenly slow to meet her eye. A neighboring farmer who had promised to help her fell trees for lumber sent word that he'd been called away on other business. It became clear that Vane, whether through direct pressure or the simple gravitational pull of his position, was quietly discouraging the town from aiding her, and Temperance understood, with the clear-eyed practicality her mother had raised her to, that she could not fight this battle with papers alone, not against a man who owned the bank that held every farmer's mortgage in the valley. She needed the descendants of the other founding families, the Coles and the Marburys, whose names had stood alongside her own ancestors on that 1841 compact, because a widow's claim to old family land might be dismissed as sentiment, but a coalition of families who could prove a documented theft spanning 3 decades was a different matter entirely, one even a friendly judge would struggle to wave away in open court. Finding them took the better part of 2 weeks, letters sent to county seats and church registries across 3 states, until she learned that a branch of the Marbury family had settled some 60 miles east, in a farming community built up by formerly enslaved families after the war, and that among them was an elderly woman named Odessa Marbury, granddaughter of one of the original compact's signatories, who still kept, tucked in a family Bible, a copy of a letter her grandmother had once written describing the Orchard Cooperative and its sudden, unexplained collapse. When Temperance traveled to meet her, carrying the tin box and its contents wrapped carefully in cloth, Odessa Marbury sat with the compact spread across her kitchen table and wept, not from sorrow alone, but from the strange, disorienting relief of watching a story her family had told for 2 generations, and which some had quietly begun to doubt, proven suddenly, undeniably true in another woman's careful hand. Odessa's own copy of her grandmother's letter, describing the land agent's visit and the pressure placed upon the families to sign, matched Eliza Cole's account almost word for word, two independent testimonies separated by decades and now brought back into the same room. Together, the two women located a Cole descendant as well, a schoolteacher in a nearby town who still possessed a small portrait of Eliza Cole and a handful of letters confirming the family's presence in the original cooperative. And with these three threads finally rewoven together, Temperance understood she no longer carried a widow's grievance alone, but the accumulated, documented memory of an entire community that had been quietly dispossessed. Armed with the compact, the corroborating letters, the burial records, and the original fraudulent deed bearing Augustus Vane's signature, Temperance approached not the county judge she suspected remained loyal to the Vane family's interests, but a circuit judge from the state capital who arrived twice yearly to hear appeals too significant for local courts to settle quietly. A man named Judge Harlan Reyes, known through the region for a reputation, rare enough to be remarked upon, of taking old land disputes seriously regardless of whose name sat comfortably atop the county's bank. She requested a formal hearing, presented her evidence with the same plain, unhurried clarity her mother had once used to calm frightened women through difficult births, and watched Cornelius Vane's composure fracture, piece by piece, as document after document was laid before the court, each one impossible to dismiss as sentiment or coincidence. Vane's lawyer argued technicalities, argued the statute of limitations, argued that whatever had happened 3 decades prior could not reasonably be undone in the present, but Judge Reyes, reviewing the compact's original language, noted dryly that a document establishing joint ownership did not simply expire because the wronged parties had been too poor, too powerless, or too occupied with survival to contest it sooner, and that fraud, once proven, carried no convenient statute protecting the man who benefited from it. The ruling, when it finally came, did not strip Cornelius Vane of his bank or his home, for the law, even when justly applied, moved carefully and without vengeance, but it did restore the orchard's original acreage, all 6 of it, jointly to the documented descendants of the 7 founding families, Temperance Whitfield among them by right of her Ashford blood. The Marburys and the Coles standing beside her in a courtroom that had likely never before seen such an alliance formally recognized. It further required the Vane family's bank to pay restitution calculated against 3 decades of harvest the cooperative had been denied, a sum modest by the standards of a bank's ledgers, but substantial enough to seed real rebuilding. And it was this ruling, more than any single dramatic confrontation, that Temperance would later describe as the quiet, unglamorous shape that justice most often takes. Paperwork and patience rewarded rather than triumph or revenge. Cornelius Vane, in the months that followed, found his standing in Amity Hollow altered in ways money alone could not repair. Farmers who had once nodded to him deferentially now met his eye evenly, and though he remained in the county, his family's long comfortable assumption that the past would stay buried had been permanently disturbed, which was, Temperance came to believe, its own form of consequence. Quieter than punishment, but no less real. With the ruling settled and the orchard's ownership restored to its rightful, shared foundation, Temperance did not seek to claim the land for herself alone, though she would have been entitled by law to a considerable portion of it. Instead, she gathered Odessa Marbury, the Cole descendant, and what remained of the scattered Ashford line, her own grown children summoned home for the occasion, and proposed reviving the original 1841 compact in spirit if not in exact letter, a cooperative once again, its harvest and labor shared among the families whose ancestors had first planted those gnarled, surviving trees. They spent that following spring pruning limbs that had gone 20 years without a blade set to them, grafting new stock onto old rootstock too stubborn to have ever truly died. And by autumn the orchard bore fruit in quantities the valley had not seen in a generation. Apples sold at the county market under a hand-painted sign reading simply Amity Hollow Orchard Cooperative, EST 1841, restored 1889. The brass key found beneath the hearth, its mystery finally solved that same spring when a Marbury cousin recognized its shape, opened a small strongbox buried at the orchard's northern boundary stone, containing not treasure in the way a lesser story might promise, but the cooperative's original charter and a modest sum of gold coin. Savings the founding families had hidden away against exactly the kind of ruin that had eventually found them. A final message from people who had understood, even in their own uncertain time, that some dangers were worth preparing for in advance. And so it was that Temperance Whitfield, a widow of 46 who had lost her farm to a banker's convenient arithmetic, who had spent $31 and then 12 more on a ruined cabin nobody else believed worth saving, came to stand once more among trees her own great-uncle had planted half a century before, restored not to wealth exactly, though the orchard did in time provide her a modest and honest living, but to something she valued considerably more, a community rebuilt on the same quiet principle that had shaped her entire life, that nothing broken, forgotten, or written off was ever quite as worthless as careless eyes assumed. The cabin itself she rebuilt plank by plank with her own hands and the help of neighbors who no longer hesitated to lend them, keeping the hearth exactly as she had found it, its flagstone reset but never mortared shut, a small deliberate reminder, she told her grandchildren in later years, that the most important things are rarely found in the places anyone expects to look, and that a woman with $31 and a dead husband's tools had once knelt before that very stone and discovered that some inheritances skip a generation only to arrive precisely when they are needed most. She lived out the remainder of her years in that cabin, among trees that bore fruit again each autumn, in a valley that had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to remember what it had once tried to forget. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Temperance Whitfield, a woman who turned 12 forgotten dollars and a broken hearth into an entire community's second chance. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs a reminder that overlooked things and overlooked people often carry more worth than the world first assumes. We would love to know, in the comments below, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had written off. Until next time, stay close.